Chapter 8, Modalities. What characteristics describe and differentiate modes? Every mode must differ from every other mode on at least one dimension, otherwise they would be the same mode. This is analogous to the idea of speciation in biology. Figure 8.2 is a first cut at this for surface passenger transport. It distinguishes primarily on the non-mechanical, non-propulsion characteristics of the service first. Multiple modes that are otherwise obviously distinct, gondolas and subways, are much the same from a transport service perspective, but one is underground and uses a train and the other is suspended by a moving cable. Their capacities may also differ. This taxonomy differentiates things that are qualitatively different rather than quantitatively different. So the first cut is about time. Is a reservation required or not? That is, does it need some advanced planning? The next columns are about time and space. Is the service scheduled or dynamic? Are the routes fixed or dynamic? If a route is fixed, are stops fixed? Does the vehicle stop at every stop or only when called, like a bus? Otherwise, if the routes are dynamic, things get a bit more ad hoc as the key question changes. This table considers the physical network. Does the mode serve you door to door, in part or in full? Is the ride shared with other parties going from different origins or to different destinations? Is the mode human-powered? Some traditional distinctions, access mode versus primary mode, are not distinguished here. Rather, that would be thought of as at least two stages of a trip, one where you walk or drive to some place with the purpose of changing modes, and second where you take some form of transit. The idea here is suggestive. By looking at the elements that define modes and adding others not shown here, propulsion technology, payment mechanisms, so on, innovation can occur. The rest of this chapter considers modes. First, we look at how accessibility explains choice of mode. We next consider the elements of trips, which are especially pertinent for more complex transit trips. The first last mile problem, the storage of cars in park and ride lots, and the line haul segment. Scheduled modes use timetables to coordinate the system. Sometimes, for very understandable reasons, unreliable systems fall out of coordination and off schedule, and bus or train bunching occurs. While travel time affects access, a full cost accessibility would also consider fares, which are often inefficient. We turn to ask about the capacity of transit systems and then compare transit use with highway use for a selected corridor. 8.1 Mode shares. The probability that an individual chooses a particular mode depends on the accessibility of that mode and others. In formal practice, mode choice can perhaps be best assessed using a discrete choice model. The difficulty is that utility, the output of choice models, is not observable and can only be estimated in models. And results from models are inherently much farther from a confirmable reality than measured and easily replicable results from direct observation, or databases constructed from direct observation. Alternatively, we can look at this issue at a simpler level. It is much easier to predict aggregate than individual behavior. It turns out that aggregate mode shares can be explained very well with observable measures of accessibility. As shown in Figure 8.4, the areas with the best transit service, where the number of jobs that can be reached by transit is nearest the number that can be reached by auto, are in the center of the city. It also turns out those are the areas with the highest transit plus walk mode share, as shown in Figure 8.3. This is no accident. Access is an indicator of the relative usefulness of the alternative modes. Places where transit and walking can reach a higher share of jobs are more likely to get users than where car is the only effective option. 8.2. First and last mile. One key aspect to accessibility that is beginning to get the attention it deserves is the first and last mile issue. For instance, with transit, we might have reliable and frequent service from the neighborhood we live in to downtown where we work. However, if the transit lets you off a mile or so from your office and we fail to make that last mile walkable or to provide other viable travel options, the transit service isn't nearly as useful, no matter how reliable and frequent we make it. Accordingly, our mindset about providing usable transit service needs to be about a lot more than the transit itself. It is not uncommon for the debate to focus on issues such as train versus bus versus streetcar, when it is just as important, if not more, to make sure that the transit is safely and easily accessed by a variety of modes. In terms of impact, the research suggests that last mile near your destination tends to be more important than the first mile near your home, when people are deciding whether or not to use transit. Getting off the train at Union Station in Denver, Colorado, for instance, the last mile options are extensive with a good walking environment, pedestrian bridges that traverse the nearby highway to the neighborhoods to the north, a bike share station that you can't help but walk past, a free bus that runs down the length of the pedestrian mall to nearly the other side of downtown, an off-road bicycling and walking trail that can bring you even further across downtown into the neighborhoods to the south, as well as taxis, pedicabs, ride-sourcing options such as Uber and Lyft, car-sharing vehicles, and even electric tuk-tuk vehicles. However, the first-mile connections can be especially important in creating a transit system that is useful for those other than commuters. For instance, good transit-oriented developments can go a long way towards solving the first-mile issue and supporting the broader goals of making a transit system that can be used by all ages for all types. Unfortunately, the default in most cities tends toward extensive park and ride facilities at the expense of location efficiency and mixed use. If the intent of a transit organization is to get as much transit ridership as quickly as possible and attract the unfortunately labeled choice rider, such a focus makes sense. While it can be exceedingly difficult to play the long game and wait for the development of land uses supportive of transit, the end result can make a dramatic difference in scope and extent of the first mile problem. And if people still want to take an auto to transit, ride-hailing services like Uber and Lyft have been more than happy to oblige, as are more traditional taxis. In fact, Lyft reports that transit stops are their number one category of destination, even more than staples such as airports or restaurants. Lyft is also being subsidized to help with the first mile issue in cities such as Centennial, Colorado, and via the Livermore-Amador Valley Transit Authority, LAVTA, in California. This helps solve the first mile issue without the opportunity cost of dedicating what can be extremely valuable land to subsidizing parked cars. 8.3. Park and ride. Most people don't find park and ride lots aesthetically appealing. Many people don't want them in their neighborhood, yet transit agencies, as in Figure 8.6, find them economically attractive as a way of solving the first mile problem in the automobile city. With the broad availability of parking in the modern world, it's not clear why park and ride lots are required, but those spaces may not be where they are needed to conveniently serve a transit stop. Let's do some math. In 1 acre, 0.4 hectares, there are 43,560 square feet, 4,047 meters squared. It takes about 300 square feet, 28 meters squared, to store a parked car, including lanes, etc. This suggests you can store 145 parked cars per acre, 360 per hectare. If every one of those parked cars carried one person, that means 145 transit boardings from that station in the morning and 145 boardings elsewhere in the evening, assuming symmetry, generating 290 daily transit trips. In contrast, let's say we had 0 park and ride spaces. Even if only workers lived there and they had 100% transit mode share for work trips and another 2 non-work trips per day by transit, that is 145 people per acre. That is the residential density equivalent of 92,800 people per square mile, 35,380 per kilometer squared. Those are Manhattan-like densities. Actually higher. Low or even medium density around the station will not enable as many transit users as the park and ride lot. Now, that doesn't mean it is cost-effective to build a park and ride lot, which depends on the value of land, on maintenance costs, whether park and ride spaces are given away for free or can be charged for, and levels of demand. It certainly doesn't mean it is cost-effective to construct a parking structure. It simply suggests that more transit riders might be generated from an acre of parking than a typical acre of transit-oriented development. However, this number should be discounted somewhat. Turns out that people who live within the nominal transit walkshed may drive to available park and ride facilities. In part, this is due to the poor pedestrian environment created by the park and ride lot in the first place. The phenomenon of park and hide also takes place in semi-urban environments without park and ride facilities. Transit users park on-street in adjacent neighborhoods. Maintenance costs are surprisingly high. A 288-stall lot generated $17,000 in plowing and $16,000 in lighting expense per year. 8.4. Line haul. The line haul complements the first and last mile. While the first mile concerns itself with getting from the origin to the main, higher capacity and faster part of the network, and the last mile from that backbone to the destination, the line haul is the travel along that backbone. The concept is important, distinguishing between the access and egress times and costs at the end of trips and the main part of the trip. Line haul also refers to the movement of freight, typically by trucks, between cities or ports. The line haul cost enumerated in Figure 8.7 is the money and time spent for a certain line haul, while the line haul rate is the cost per mile or per kilometer. These costs include such line items as fuel, labor, time, administration, tolls, insurance, registration, maintenance, and depreciation. However, some of these costs depend on what's being shipped and its weight. Line haul even refers to the transporting of people, particularly between important transit terminals, train stations, and airports. For instance, we might want to compare the line haul travel times and costs for the various modal options, like a train, bus, taxi, and ride sourcing, in getting from a typical Union Station to the airport and back. Sometimes the line haul takes less time than access and egress, for instance with air travel for shorter distance trips, While not generally called out, the idea applies to automobile travel as well, as travelers use local streets for the first and last miles and highways for the middle of the trip. 8.5. Timetables. Scheduled transport services such as buses, trains, and airplanes follow timetables, which indicate when a vehicle will arrive or depart at a given stop or station. While timetables like that in Figure 8.8 are designed to serve the daily pattern of demand, they are constrained by many other things, such as there are only so many vehicles available, vehicles may need to be repositioned, deadheading or the red eye, for future demands, there are only so many drivers, pilots, and crew available, there are only so many gates available, and so on. So the distribution of actual services is flatter than consumers would demand in an unconstrained environment. This mismatch of service availability and desired departure or arrival times both creates crowding and is one of the factors that pushes people toward unscheduled, on-demand modes of transport. 8.6. Bus bunching. When they reach the end of the line, there might be 2 or 3 or more buses one right after another, and then no buses for 20, 30, 40, or 50 minutes. Yet the buses were dispatched on a schedule from the start of the line every 10 minutes. What happened? Along the way, buses bunched, as illustrated in Figure 8.9. Somewhere near the middle of the route, a passenger waiting for the bus may wait 20 minutes despite the 10-minute posted headway, and then say 2 buses arrive at once. Why does this occur? The answer is stochastic arrivals. People arrive randomly at bus stops. Sometimes many people arrive at once. When bus A gets to the stop, those many people take longer to board than fewer people would. The bus departs later than scheduled. At the next bus stop, more people have accumulated since the actual time between buses was longer than scheduled. Boarding takes longer still. The bus falls farther behind schedule. Meanwhile, the following bus, B, gets ahead of schedule, since fewer people at each stop than expected, since people board the first bus that arrives at the stop after they do. If bus A was supposed to arrive at 8:10 and bus B at 8:20, but bus A was 5 minutes late, bus A then must board 15 minutes of arriving passengers and bus B only boards 5 minutes worth of arriving passengers. Eventually, bus B catches up with bus A on a long route. The buses are bunched. There are no perfect solutions to this problem. It is a natural feature of this kind of dynamic stochastic system, and is related to the hitchhiker's paradox, which explains the long delays associated with uniform arrivals and random servers, and occurs at the best-run transit organizations. Strategies for minimizing bus bunching include making buses adhere to static schedules, which works with low-frequency and uncongested systems but breaks down as demand rises, holding buses at control points to restore the desired headway, delaying bus B, inserting buses, bus C, midway along the route at control points if the gap between buses becomes too long, allowing buses to overtake, bus B passes bus A, skipping stops, allowing passengers on bus A to alight but taking on no or a limited number of new passengers, reducing bus delays with traffic signal priority and better designed stops that require payment before boarding, reduced dwell time through all-door boarding, replacing buses with rail-based services with higher capacities and longer headways. Creative people may think of others. Making the system work well is critical to attracting riders. If headways are functionally 20 minutes rather than 10 minutes, accessibility is lost. 8.7. Fares. Fares may be unfair. The fare map in Figure 8.10 was in place when the famous Kingston Trio song MTA about a fare increase by Boston's Metropolitan Transit Authority came out. The lyrics go, "Well, let me tell you the story of a man named Charlie on a tragic and fateful day. He put 10 cents in his pocket, kissed his wife and family, and went to ride on the MTA. Well, did he ever return? No, he never returned, and his fate is still unknown. He may ride forever 'neath the streets of Boston. He's the man who never returned. Charlie handed in his dime at the Kendall Square station, and he changed for Jamaica Plain. When he got there, the conductor told him, 1 more nickel. Charlie couldn't get off that train." Some transit operations only require you to pay when you board and have a flat fare. Others require that you tap in and tap out, that is, pay when you exit, at least loosely proportional to how far you traveled. The advantage of the distance-based fares is their fairness. Cost increases with distance traveled, so shouldn't fares? The disadvantage is the increased collection costs. Some system needs to track passengers by boarding and alighting location, and the delays imposed on exiting as passengers queue up at the exit turnstiles. The same issue arises with road pricing. Some systems charge based on distance traveled with entry and exit toll booths, others have payment gantries along the way, and some just charge at the on-ramp. Practical considerations trading off collection costs for increased payment efficiency determine the system design. However, once it is in place, it is very hard to change. People very much dislike new points of payment, more so than just increased fares. 8.8. Transit capacity. Taking advantage of existing capacity is far more cost-effective than building new capacity. What is the existing capacity of transit? How much is used? Capacity depends on assumptions and human behavior. The table below works through some scenarios based on assumptions from Minneapolis. How many hours per day is the line operating? H. What is the frequency within that time period? T over H. How many cars per train are there? C over T. What is the capacity per car? Cars are rated at 230 passengers, P max, but this includes standees. P max divided by C. How long is the line and number of stations? S. How long, how many stations is the average trip, excluding boarding station? Lowercase s. How many directions are you considering? D. This measures capacity in terms of daily boardings. Daily distance traveled is another, perhaps better measure of capacity utilization, but this is not tracked since there is no tap-off process at stations in Minneapolis-St. Paul. This is illustrated through an example of the Green Line, a light rail transit line connecting Minneapolis and St. Paul along University Avenue. Table 8.1 shows some surprisingly high numbers, up to 7 million, under the admittedly silly unconstrained scenario A, where people only ride the train for one stop before alighting, trains run for 24 hours a day, and people are standing at near crush capacity, with more plausible numbers in the 255,000 territory, assuming everyone gets a seat, but the train can run at 5-minute headways, C. The numbers are in contrast with very low, with the admittedly silly over-constrained scenario E, where everyone rides the whole line from end to end. The main point is that even with a September 2017 average ridership of 48,859, there's a lot of capacity on the Green Line yet to go, even if the train only runs 18 hours a day. This analysis demonstrates that transport capacity is not the constraint in land development along the Green Line corridor. Certainly load balancing is an issue. Much of the capacity is off-peak. But that is what pricing is for. Higher loads would increase wear and tear on the cars and add costs, but hopefully the added revenues would more than compensate. Given there is a lot of developable land in existing corridors, one rhetorically asks, why are new corridors being subsidized for development? 8.9. Modal magnitudes. Car culture remains dominant in Minnesota, as we can see comparing the observations in the highway capacity section with the transit capacity example. The number of people using I-94 on a given weekday is about 20 times larger than the number of people using the Green Line. A $1 billion transit investment, the Green Line, is rounding error for the change in traffic count on the parallel highway, comparing entering vehicles between Lowry and Dale for October 2014, 244,103, and October 2013, 244,712, average weekday traffic. Induced demand may explain part of this, but these two facilities also serve very different markets. Transit investments like the Green Line LRT serve transit users. Highway investments like I-94 serve highway users. They are, at this point in history, at this location, barely substitutes. Congestion reduction should not be a selling point for transit investments, just as reducing crowding on trains or buses is not a valid selling point of highways.